Starting from LCS, follow the traffic on Main Street. Make an easy left.
Just thinking of the World Wide Web and its pointers, every human being has these spaghetti things going out to every other computer and human being, and there's this gigantic, massive spaghetti spanning the entire globe. And if you want to find out something, how do you find it out?
The bits are moving around so fast that hardly anyone has thought to preserve them, to archive them. And the way the technology is changing hasn't helped us either. You know, a piece of paper sticks around for 500 years, and by golly, it's legible to human eyes. So it's not likely that human eyes are going to change in another 500 years. But of course, disks and memory and data formats change every couple of years.
As the huge and vastly growing human record, all the data that we as mankind are accumulating is growing so rapidly. Who has time, who has the energy, who has the resources to keep looking back and seeing if old information, still useful, is being transformed to the new media before the old media are essentially unusable.
素晴らしい新世界、デジタルワールドへの船出。世界中の情報と知識を電子的に記録収集し、そして交互に結びつける。それはすでに指先一つで可能である。しかしデジタル化された大量の情報や急速に発達したコンピューター社会のダイナミズムが複雑な問題を引き起こしていることもまた真実である。その問題の一つに、デジタル情報を長期間にわたって保存することにほとんど関心が払われなかったことが挙げられる。重要でかけがえのない情報を確実な方法で保存し、私たちだけでなく私たちの子孫もまた利用できるように残していかなければならない。過去から現在にわたって蓄積された膨大な知識や記憶は文明の核であり、人類そのものの記録といっても過言ではない。それがまさに今存続の危機にさらされている。1992年8月25日、サラエボ。ボスニア・ヘルツェゴビナの民族紛争では多くの貴重な記録を破壊し、民族の文化とアイデンティティを消し去ろうと砲兵隊はこぞって国立図書館に何百発というロケット弾を撃ち込んだ。その結果、何万もの貴重なイスラムの経典、16世紀の手書きによる貴重な書物、そしてボスニア、クロアチア、セルビアの作家や詩人の作品の数々など300万冊以上が地球上から消え去った。市民など懸命な努力によって戦火を逃れたものもあったが、大部分は炎に包まれ灰と化した。災害は常に我々人類の記録を脅かしてきた。火事、洪水、地震、戦争、加えて100年間にわたる紙に含まれる酸による書籍の侵食、いわゆるスローファイヤーによって文明の歴史は傷つけられ破壊されてきた。しかし人類の記録を物理的に保存するだけでは十分とは言えない。その記録を解読し、意味を理解していく能力が欠かせないのだ。例えばエジプトのヒエログリフはいまだ完全には解読されていない。何千年も完璧な形で保存されてきたにもかかわらず、その意味だけが時を失っているのだ。ロンドンの大英博物館に2000年以上も前の1メートル余りの黒い石が眠っている。石には複雑な文字が刻まれている。1799年にエジプトの砂漠で発見されたこの石は あの有名なロゼッタストーンである。刻まれていた情報はありきたりな内容であるが、全く同じ内容が別の3つの言語で書かれていることが注目された。ヒエログリフ、デモティック、そして唯一判読可能なギリシャ文字である。ロゼッタストーンの出現は古代文明全般に書かれたものを解読理解するための重要な鍵となった。長年知識を記録し利用するための手段として用いられてきた石は紙にその座を明け渡し、その紙も早くも新しいものに取って代わられようとしている。カリフォルニア州ゴールドストーンにある通信施設。この巨大なアンテナは NASA のディープスペースネットワークの一部で、数百万キロ彼方の人工衛星から送られてくるデジタル信号を受信することができる。1958年以来 NASA の宇宙探査機から送信されるデータは膨大な量に上っている。地球環境を調査している宇宙ミッションからはさらに大量のデータが生み出される。オゾン層の破壊、地球温暖化や砂漠化、その他地球環境を脅かすさまざまなデータが送信されてくる。しかし膨大な費用をかけて得た貴重なデータを記録した磁気テープが今危機にさらされている。
20 years ago or more, the projects were so focused on building the spacecraft and getting the fundamental technology proven and getting to the first visit of the planets that people really didn't look at saving the data for when the mission was over. For example, Viking that went to Mars, the key part of the mission was around 1976. Well, this is 20 years later, those tapes are decomposing. Now that was a heavily investigated planet and mission, and a lot of people were familiar with the data, but now enough time has passed. Many of the people have retired, or it's not easy to access the tapes, and it becomes much more important to have them in an archive form.
Historically, magnetic tapes, which was the main storage media used until just 4 or 5 years ago, you can take one out of the box, record it, and then try to read it and have an error on it. That's how bad it is. And some of the conversion efforts that we've done over the last few years, we're finding 10 or 20% of the tapes have errors on them. So magnetic tape is just a disaster for an archival storage media.
The problem with preservation is one which archivists and librarians think about because that's their business. But unfortunately, computer science as a field has not had very much interest in this problem. I'm not sure that it isn't aware of it, but it has a mindset that says, you know, we are in the business of charging ahead into the future and dropping the past behind us and not carrying the baggage of old, obsolete systems. People are more interested in what's the new paradigm, how are we going to create new, more exciting hypermedia with new capabilities that have never existed. But those new capabilities, those paradigm shifts, leave old documents stranded in the past with no bridge to the future.
ワシントン DC にある国立公文書館。ここには200年以上にわたるアメリカの公文書が保管され、その中には建国の際の文書も含まれている。果てしなく続く書架に政府のあらゆるタイプの公文書がずらりと並ぶ。条約、書簡、特許、地図、建造物の製図、30億枚に上る文書など、いずれもその歴史的価値が認められたものばかりである。またここには何百万にも及ぶマイクロフィルムや写真ネガ、映画フィルムから蓄音レコード、ビデオ、カセットテープなどといったさまざまな記録媒体が保管されている。最近では機械で読み取り可能な資料も法律に基づき受け入れられている。2000年までには連邦政府の書類の 75% は完全にコンピューター化されると予想されている。メリーランドにある国立公文書館電子記録センターでは、保健、福祉、犯罪調査、人口や住居に関する資料など 800種類以上のデジタルデータに加え、連邦政府機関から送られてくる膨大な量の電子メールも受け入れている。そしてこのような保管すべきデジタル資料の量は毎年倍増している。
You can't have a democracy if the government is not accountable to people. And one of the ultimate ways that this government is accountable to people is by maintaining records of what the government did, what it said its policies were, and therefore enabling the people to figure out whether the government acted in accordance with policy and law. Traditionally, we, like basically all the archives in the world that deal with electronic records, ask the originators to send it to us in a form that's not dependent on any specific hardware or software, because we have to presume that most of our customers who haven't been born yet are going to want this information at a time when all of the technology used to generate it has disappeared from the marketplace.
ニューヨークのハイウェイ、毎日有害廃棄物を積んだ何百台ものトラックが行き交う。どのトラックも認可を受けており、廃棄物処理場に行くために州を縦横無尽に走っている。オーバニーにある電子記録センターでは1000種類以上もの巨大なデータベースを扱っている。有害廃棄物認可システムはその一つに過ぎないが、非常に大切なものだ。近年、社会の存続に不可欠で長期間にわたってアクセスできなければならない情報がますます電子的な形態で作成されている。毒物や放射性物質、有害廃棄物の保管場所を記録した情報もその中の一つである。コンピューターによる地理情報システムを使えば、廃棄物処理場の位置を瞬時に確認できる。このシステムは廃棄物処理場が淡水の湿地帯と人口の中心部に与える影響への研究にも一役買っている。ラブカナルで起きた悲惨な事件を繰り返さないためにも欠くことのできないシステムである。これは新しいデジタル技術標準によって忠実に置き換えられ続け、永久に保存されなければならない情報の一例と言えるだろう。
We have to have experts that understand systems and how to migrate them. We have to have routines in place for migrating information from one form to another. And those kinds of organizational issues need to be put in place and routinized so that they are part of the cultural fabric, not something new that we have to fret about. They have to be ordinary events in our daily lives. And it's moving from a period where we don't understand all the pieces that have to be put in place and their interrelationships to a point where we are naturally dealing with digital information and moving it forward as interest requires. That is the major cultural change and the nub of the problem that we're really facing here.
州や地方自治体、企業などの保管記録や公文書の中には、もはや情報化時代の残骸となりつつあるものもある。重要なデジタル情報が判読不可能になっている。オレゴン州では身体障害者に関する主要なデータベースが消滅した。ニューヨーク州ではペンシルバニア鉄道会社の企業記録が消えてしまった。いくつかの大きな州では土地利用に関する貴重なデータがソフトの紛失のために判読不可能な状況となった。膨大な量の情報が音もなく人知れずに消えてしまう。気づいた時はすでに手遅れなのだ。
Whether records survive or not depends on whether we as a society think it's important to see that they survive. And one of the differences between digital preservation and preserving traditional formats of records is that digital records don't just survive by accident. We have to make a conscious decision that they're worth keeping. We have to think about that when we create them in the first place in terms of the standards that we use. We have to really make a commitment to keeping them alive in a way that we haven't had to in the past. That's not to say that we haven't dealt with fragile materials, but we would run across things by accident that had been stored in an attic or a basement, and 50 years later or 100 years later still be able to read and retrieve and understand them. That won't be the case with digital records unless we make some kinds of conscious plans and have regular vigilance over them.
アメリカ図書館協会が毎年主催する総会には、出版の概念を一から見直そうと挑む出版関係者たちが集まり、自社の新製品を参加者に売り込む。
Now do is say I want to go to, oops, where to go?
Search full text,
Well, somebody
which we call level 1, or we can customize our search, and we call that level 2.
And we have the African American experience, the American Revolution, Civil War, Westward Expansion.
デジタルブックやデジタルネットワークの出現によって、情報を持つ者と持たざる者との格差が生じるのではないかと図書館員は懸念を抱いている。この問題に解決策を提示しようとしているのがニューヨーク公共図書館である。
Few families in New York have the means to have internet access at home. So, for those who don't, this is our attempt to level the playing field. You could get off the airplane at Kennedy from Zambia, take a taxi in to the Science, Industry, and Business Library. No one will ask you for a piece of identification, for a library card, for a fee, but you just walk in the door, sit yourself at a computer, get on the internet, pull down a database, do whatever you wish for free.
One of the things that concerns me most is that there's such an enthusiasm for putting information into digital form. Many libraries are rushing into digital projects, and sometimes at the expense of their preservation microfilming projects. And the worst nightmare I can imagine is that all of the money that had been going into preserving books in the traditional way, microfilming or conservation projects, will be diverted to providing access to digital information without making any provisions for preserving it, so that money is being drained from the traditional preservation projects and nothing is being done about preserving the new digital information. And then we'd lose twice.
A lot of the new material that's getting created artistically and in a scholarly sense is being created electronically to begin with. It doesn't exist on paper, it doesn't get published in magazines anymore, only gets published on the web or published in electronic form of some sort. And so we're in danger of losing all of that if we don't solve this problem.
ボイジャー社はデジタルブックの生産と発行では全米屈指の会社である。将来的な保存とアクセスの問題への関心が低い反面、デジタル化の可能性を追求することは非常に刺激的で関心も高いようだ。
What you'll be able to do is access a movie, which would be through this mirror. There'll be a timeline, a map of where Dracula exists.
What I'm working on is called Witness to the Future. It's a CD about environmental activism. What I have to do before I give everything to my programmer is make sure all the content is correct and everything's laid out, so all the graphics are fixed and everything.
I can't imagine that anything that we are making today will be available 100 years from now. I don't even think it'll be available 25 years from now. In fact, a lot of stuff that we made 7 or 8 years ago can't be played. I mean, there are two problems. One is the durability of the media itself, and the other is the machines they play on. And nobody really knows how long the media will last, although our indications are that entropy takes over fairly quickly, and these things have a tendency to degrade much faster than anybody, at least in the companies that makes them, is willing to predict. And the second problem, though, is that the machines go out of style. And nobody bothers at the time to sort of make a translation program. And if you go out 100 years from now, the possibility that somebody will, have remembered to make a machine that runs Microsoft Windows 2.2, it's impossible. It won't happen.
Each of the media seems to be racing the others towards obsolescence as fast as it can. And in a sense, that's because they're each trying to improve as fast as they can. And so the new versions come faster and faster, and new versions make the old versions obsolete and unreadable. So it's a natural process, but it's one that we have to recognize is not helpful from a preservation point of view.
We get stuff that's 3 years old now, outdated. We pick up scrap computers from many companies in this valley, National Semiconductor, LSI Logic, Cypress Semiconductor. I mean, the list goes on, but I don't want to mention my customers. I have competition.
That's a good chip.
I estimate about $300 million for this load of mainframes is what they paid for them. And they're outdated in 8 years.
Computers were created essentially to service giant organizations, and they were tended by a sort of a priesthood of technicians. But once computers went from being something that exclusively belonged to large organizations to something that served and belonged to individuals, a tremendous amount of translation, psychological and sociological translation needed to be done. What I did was translate some of the ideas that belonged to the priesthood of technicians and made it accessible and usable to civilians, to ordinary people.
多くの情報が電子的に蓄積されればされるほど、私たちは情報の壊滅的な消失の危険性にさらされる。
I have a PowerBook, the 5300, and it was supposed to be the latest, newest model, and apparently it had some problems in its development, and the logic board cracked, and shortly thereafter I lost my hard drive and everything, my world.
コンピューターがクラッシュしても諦めてはいけない。データ修復の専門家に依頼すれば、脆くて複雑なディスクドライブからうまくデータを捕まえ、よみがえらせることができる。
Crash is where the drive doesn't work anymore. A crash can be a multiple of different things, though. A crash can be where the head actually makes contact and starts scraping off the medium that's on the platter that holds the data. That's the disk right there. That's the metal that the data is saved to. Now we're going to show you where we are magnifying onto each track. See these lines? There's sectors where data is kept, like a filing cabinet. It's kept in a particular spot. The data is stored in between these marks, and everyone has an address or an identification. If the data is all scraped off or gone, there's nothing we can do. But if there's something on that in that device that we can get to, we get to it within about a 95% ratio.
カフェやオフィス、自宅や図書館、そして学校でも人々はインターネットを楽しもうとコンピューターにかかりっきりだ。ワールドワイドウェブという技術が変えた唯一のもの、それは全てである。
People go online. They play with aspects of themselves. They express pieces of themselves that they're not always aware that we're even there. It's like Cyrano de Bergerac finding in the virtual reality of writing something about himself, a capacity for love and passion that he didn't even know was there. People are discovering that online.
It's a great place to meet people. Playing with this website.
We're talking about fundamental infrastructural changes in our society with this new electronic technology. So it's not any one particular application and so on. It is just a fundamental new kind of wiring for our society. Like 100 years ago, we put in the electricity system. We put in the telephone system and so on. Those completely transformed how we lived. Today, we're moving into that same kind of almost punctuated evolution to the infrastructure, having now to do with things like the World Wide Web that absolutely transform our ability to connect to others, our ability to basically view all the information in the world in one kind of homogeneous type of access structure and form.
It was a combination of the web, the browsers, and the underlying internet that existed for 15 years, which created what we now see as the web browser phenomenon that everyone is using. There's so much talk today about technology leading to unemployment and causing difficulty that I think we forget that technology is humanity's child. We have created it. To love it is to love ourselves. And second, it does help us.
ウェブを作ったのはイギリスの若き科学者ティム・バーナース・リーで、ウェブを運営する協会のディレクターとして MIT のオフィスから未来を導こうとしている。しかしウェブの登場により文書の概念は大きく変化し、その保存を担う我々の責務は複雑なものになってしまった。
If you remember the world before the World Wide Web, it was a question of getting information from one place to another by tracking down a group of experts who could log on to the right computer, find out how to extract the information from the relevant program, how to put it onto a floppy disk, then how to read the floppy disk on your own computer, then what to do with the data when you've got it. All this was a question of conversion and incompatibility, and the world was full of incompatibility. It was incompatible because a lot of the formats were proprietary formats owned by one manufacturer, to which another manufacturer would not commit. So in order to get the interoperability, you have to have open standards. That was the way I saw it. The web is an open, universal medium like paper. The web itself doesn't constrain what information you put on it. You've got to expect all kinds of information. There's some indecent material out there. There is advertising material out there. There's material from hate groups, which you wouldn't want anybody to read. There is information you really sympathize with, and there's some beautiful stuff out there. So the commercialization of it, its use in advertising, for example, its use for trade, is all part of the world, and it's very important that a universal medium should accept all types of information.
The whole concept of linked nonlinear documents makes preservation very tricky, because where do you draw the boundary around a document? If my document references 16 other documents by having links to them, then what does it mean to preserve my document? Do we also have to preserve all of those other 16 documents and transitively all of the documents that they reference and point to? And you can think of the web as one huge interlinked connection of documents. You could think of it as a single document if you wanted to. It's not quite where we are at the moment, but it's a reasonable model. And if you do that, then what does it mean to preserve that? How do you even describe what you've got? And it's dynamic, it's changing every moment. People are adding things to it, modifying things to it. So we just don't have the understanding yet, the conceptual understanding of what we're doing and where it's going that would enable us to make sensible decisions or choices about preservation.
Information highway, electronic publishing, I think will sound in 20 years like horseless carriage sounds to us now, because they're all analogies to something that's an old technology, to highways, to libraries. And I think this technology really changes everything. It changes the way we communicate. And we basically need a new language to describe these new relationships and the new styles of seeing and teaching and learning. If you begin from thinking about it as a communications medium, then the social policies have to concern free speech, have to concern education, have to concern public access. So it's the narrow focus on transportation of commodities on an information highway that I think limits our field way too much.
One of my favorite examples of longevity is a wonderful line from one of the Shakespeare sonnets. And in fact, this is a photograph from the Folger Library of their 1609 quarto edition of the sonnets. That was when the sonnets were first published, so nearly 400 years ago. And the 18th sonnet, which is one of the most famous, which begins, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" ends with the couplet, "So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." And what I love about that is that the "this" in the couplet is the sonnet itself. It's a poem that's referring to itself as a work of literature. And the inference is that he knew, or guessed, that this thing that he was writing under his hand as the ink came out would last forever. Well, it's only been 400 years, but I would say there's a fair chance that if anything lasts, the Shakespearean sonnets will. We need to do something equivalent for digital information. We have, at the moment, a very poor chance that a current Shakespeare writing deathless prose, deathless poetry at the moment will see their lines last for anything like the next 400 years.
この詩が君に命を与えるのだ。そう、人類の記録こそが文明に命を与えることができる。印刷物の世界とデジタルの世界の狭間にある人類の記録を我々は未来へ向かって保存し続けなければならないのである。